The auctioneer moved through the yard at a pace that suggested he had already mentally closed the sale before the bidding started. It was a dispersal auction, the kind that happens when a man dies without a succession plan and his estate needs to be liquidated in a single morning. The farm outside Liberal, Kansas, had belonged to Earl Tatum, who had run a wheat and grain sorghum operation on leased ground for 31 years before a stroke took him in February. Earl had no children. His nearest relative was a nephew in Wichita who had not been to the farm in 11 years and who had hired an auction company to clear the equipment because the alternative was managing it himself. The nephew had set no reserves. He wanted the property empty and the proceeds in a check by Friday. The Massey Ferguson 5711 was the last significant piece of equipment in the yard. It had not been the last piece by accident. The auction company's ringman had looked at it the previous day during the preview and made a quiet professional assessment. Flood damage to the cab, seized engine, destroyed electrical system from what appeared to be a combination of moisture intrusion and rodent activity in the wiring harness. The hydraulic system had not been tested because the engine wouldn't turn over. The ringman had positioned the machine at the end of the auction order because he knew what happened when a crowd that had already spent its money watched a damaged tractor go across. The number would be low. Better to get there when the serious buyers had already loaded and left. By the time the auctioneer reached the 5711, the yard had thinned. The two John Deere tractors had sold in the first hour at prices that reflected strong demand and a competitive crowd. The tillage equipment had moved steadily. The grain handling items had drawn good numbers from local elevator operators who had made the drive specifically for them. What remained in the yard when the auctioneer pointed at the Massey Ferguson was a smaller group, the buyers who stayed to the end, because the end was where the distressed equipment appeared, and distressed equipment was what they had come for. Walter Grubb had been at the back of that group since 9 o'clock. He was 66 years old. He had spent 40 years working in John Deere dealership service bays, the last 22 of them as a senior technician at a dealership in Meade County, Kansas, that had employed him until a corporate consolidation had eliminated his position 14 months earlier. The consolidation had been handled in the way that corporate consolidations of regional dealerships are typically handled, with paperwork, with HR language about workforce restructuring, and with a severance check that did not reflect 4 decades of accumulated mechanical knowledge walking out the door. Walter had taken the check, cleaned out his toolbox, and driven home to the property outside Liberal, where he had lived for 31 years, and where his wife had already begun asking him what he was going to do with himself. He had not answered that question directly. He had built a shop addition onto the existing detached garage, 12 by 24 feet, heated, with a proper lift he had located through a dealer equipment liquidation and purchased for less than a quarter of its replacement cost. He had arranged his tools, which were substantial, along the walls with the precision of a man who has organized tools his entire working life. He had a workbench, a parts washer, a hydraulic press, and a set of diagnostic equipment that covered the major agricultural equipment platforms he had worked on across 4 decades. He had a laptop with service manual subscriptions. And he had, as of the auction morning in March, no particular plan for what came through the shop door. He had come to the Tatum dispersal because dispersal auctions are where a man who knows machinery and has limited capital finds the intersection of low price and high potential. Walter had attended 11 equipment auctions in the 14 months since his layoff. He had bought 3 machines, a used sprayer he had repaired and sold, a loader tractor he had sold to a neighbor, and a hay rake he had fixed and used himself. He had made money on 2 of the 3 and broken even on the 3rd. He was not operating at scale. He was operating at the pace of a man who is figuring out what comes next by doing it, rather than by planning it. When the auctioneer reached the Massey Ferguson 5711, Walter moved forward from the back of the group. The auctioneer opened at 500. Nothing moved. He dropped to 400. One hand went up, Walter's. Nobody countered. The auctioneer looked around the yard with the practiced patience of a man who has sold equipment nobody wanted in front of crowds that had already left. He said 400 once, 400 twice. He said sold. Walter paid cash. He arranged transport through a neighbor with a flatbed. The machine was on his lot by 3 o'clock that afternoon. He did not start the inspection that day. He had learned across 40 years of dealership work that the worst time to assess a damaged machine is immediately after acquiring it, when the mind is still running the acquisition math and the eyes are looking for confirmation rather than information. He covered the machine with a tarp, went inside, had supper with his wife, and watched the evening news. The next morning he went to the shop at 7 o'clock with a fresh notebook and began. The cab flood damage was the first thing he documented, systematically, panel by panel. The headliner had deteriorated, the seat was destroyed, the instrument cluster had visible corrosion on the connector pins. The wiring harness through the cab showed rodent damage at 3 locations: chewed insulation, compromised conductors, one section where the damage was severe enough that replacement rather than repair was the correct approach. He pulled the section and measured it and wrote down the part number. The engine seizure was the critical question, and he approached it the way he approached every critical question, with the assumption that the answer was not yet known, and that the path to knowing it required removing enough material to see clearly. He pulled the valve cover first. What he found was not what flood damage typically produces. The engine had not hydrolocked from water intrusion, a failure mode that usually means a destroyed engine, bent rods, cracked block. What he found was an engine that had seized from oil starvation. The oil was present but badly degraded, the kind of degradation that happens when a machine sits for an extended period after a final run with contaminated oil, and the oil film on critical bearing surfaces breaks down over time until the surfaces contact each other and seize. The damage was to the main bearings. The crankshaft had spun a bearing on the number 3 journal. The bore was intact. The heads were intact. The block was intact. Walter sat on his shop stool and looked at the engine for a while. A spun bearing on a seized engine sounds like a totaled engine to most people who hear those words. To a man who has rebuilt agricultural diesel engines across 40 years in service bays, it is a different conversation. The crankshaft would need to go out for grinding. The journal surface was damaged and had to be brought back to a precise dimension before an undersized bearing set could be installed. That was machine work he would send out. The rest of the rebuild was in his hands. He had the tools, the service data, the parts knowledge, and the patience. He did not have urgency, which was the most valuable thing a man rebuilding a seized engine can possess. He called a machine shop in Liberal he had used for dealership work over the years. The shop quoted $340 for the crankshaft grinding. Walter sourced the undersized bearing set himself from a supplier in Wichita. $220 for the full set, correct specification for the ground journals. He pulled the engine down over the weekend, extracted the crankshaft Monday, had it back from the machine shop Wednesday. He assembled the bottom end with the attention to clearance and torque specification that 40 years of this work had made automatic. He started the engine on a Thursday morning. It ran rough for 40 seconds while oil pressure built and the new bearings seated. Then it smoothed. He ran it for an hour at varying RPM, listening for bearing distress. He heard nothing that concerned him. The engine had cost him $560 in parts and machine work and 11 days of his own labor. The electrical repair took 4 more days. The cab wiring harness section that had been destroyed by rodents was a sourced replacement, $340 from a supplier who stocked MF5711 components. The instrument cluster connector pins cleaned with electrical contact cleaner and showed continuity after cleaning. The cab panels and headliner he sourced from a parts machine he located through an online agricultural equipment listing, a 5711 with a destroyed drivetrain and an intact cab, located in Oklahoma, whose owner sold him the interior components for $180 including the seat. Walter drove to Oklahoma on a Saturday and was back by Sunday afternoon. The hydraulic system, which he had not been able to test before the auction, turned out to be the best news of the entire project. No damage. The pump tested within specification. The cylinders extended and retracted correctly. The system had been better protected from the conditions that had damaged everything else by the geometry of the machine and by what appeared to be a functioning cab seal that had failed from the top but held from below. Total parts expenditure to bring the Massey Ferguson 5711 to full operational condition, $1,760. The auction price, $400. Total investment, $2,160, plus Walter's labor, which he was not counting as a cost because the alternative to spending that time in his shop was spending it not in his shop, which was not an alternative he found appealing. He drove the machine out of the shop on a Tuesday morning in early May. The MF 5711 ran cleanly. The hydraulics responded correctly. The cab was dry, the instruments functional, the seat new. Walter ran it across his lot and back and shut it down and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he called a farmer he had known for 20 years, a man named Don Perkins, who ran a wheat operation 12 miles south, and who had mentioned at a co-op meeting the previous fall that he was in the market for a utility tractor. Don came over that afternoon. He walked around the machine. He asked what had been wrong with it. Walter told him, in the same complete and direct way he had documented everything, what the auction condition had been, what he had found, and what he had done. Don asked what Walter wanted for it. Walter said $22,500. Don said that was fair. He asked if he could bring it back if anything surfaced in the first 30 days. Walter said yes. Don wrote the check. The machine never came back. What came back, starting 2 weeks after Don drove the 5711 home, was Don's neighbor, who had heard the story and had an MF6S with a hydraulic issue he couldn't get the regional dealer to schedule. Then Don's neighbor's brother-in-law with a different machine and a different problem. Then a farmer from 2 counties over who had driven past the dealer in Liberal without stopping and followed directions to Walter's shop from a man at the grain elevator who had heard from Don's neighbor that there was a retired Deere technician outside Liberal who could work on Massey Ferguson equipment at rates that made sense. Walter had not planned to work on other people's equipment. He had planned to find machines at auction, restore them, and sell them. The first machine had sold cleanly and profitably. The second machine he bought, a flood-damaged MF6S he located at an estate sale in Comanche County for $600, was sitting in his shop awaiting inspection when the neighbor's call came in. Walter did both. He worked on the neighbor's machine and he assessed the 6S. He found, in that combination, something he had not expected to find in retirement. The same satisfaction he had gotten from the best years of dealership work, without the scheduling pressure, the upsell requirements, the corporate efficiency metrics, and the documentation overhead that the dealership had built around every hour of shop time in the last decade before the consolidation. The work was the same. The conditions were different. The conditions were better. By the end of the first full year operating from his shop, Walter had restored and sold 4 machines and had taken in repair work from 19 farms across 3 counties. He had not advertised. He had a handwritten sign at the end of his driveway that said farm equipment repair and a phone number. Every customer who called had been sent by someone else who had called before them. Walter kept a notebook of every job, machine, problem, diagnosis, parts, labor hours, charge. He kept the notebook the same way he had kept service records at the dealership, with the same level of completeness. Because a man who has spent 40 years creating the documentation that protects both the shop and the customer does not abandon the practice when the shop is his own. The notebook at the end of the first year showed $78,000 in revenue across repair work and machine sales combined. Walter had expected less. He was not disappointed by more. He was thoughtful about it in the way he was thoughtful about engine clearances, precisely without excitement, focused on what the number meant rather than how it felt. What it meant was that the demand was real and the service gap was real, and his position at the intersection of 40 years of mechanical knowledge and a regional dealer network that could not serve the smaller and older end of the market at prices those customers could sustain was not an accident. It was a structural condition. It had existed before Walter arrived at his shop. It would exist after. He had not created the gap, he was filling it, the way a man fills any gap that his specific capabilities are suited to fill, without drama and without a business plan, one machine at a time. The second year came in at $112,000. Walter hired his first help, a part-time arrangement with a young man named Curtis Hale, who had grown up on a farm in Kiowa County and had 2 years of vocational agricultural mechanics behind him. Curtis worked 3 days a week. Walter paid him fairly and taught him the way he had been taught at the beginning of his own career, by doing the work beside him, explaining what he was looking at and why, letting Curtis make the diagnosis and then checking it. By the end of the second year, Curtis was working 5 days a week and handling straightforward repairs independently, while Walter handled the diagnostic work that required depth of experience. The regional Massey Ferguson dealer in Liberal had heard about Walter's shop by the end of the first year, through the same channels that all such information travels in agricultural communities. A customer mention, a service inquiry that referenced Walter's name, a pattern in the dealer's work orders suggesting that a category of customers had stopped appearing. The dealer's service manager drove past Walter's property without stopping, which Walter's wife observed from the kitchen window and reported to Walter without editorial comment. Walter said he expected that. His wife said she supposed so. The dealer principal called in the spring of the second year. He asked Walter if he was interested in a conversation about an authorized service relationship. Walter said he was willing to have the conversation. The dealer principal described the authorization requirements, training certification, tooling requirements, parts procurement through authorized channels, labor rate minimums that the manufacturer required for warranty reimbursement. Walter listened to all of it and asked 2 questions. The first was whether the authorized labor rate minimum was above or below his current rate. The dealer principal said it was above his current rate. Walter said that meant he would have to charge his customers more to comply with the authorization. The dealer principal said the authorization would bring warranty work that offset the rate increase. Walter asked what percentage of his current work involved machines under warranty. There was a pause. The dealer principal said he understood the situation. Walter said he appreciated the call. He did not pursue the authorization. What the conversation confirmed, in a way that Walter had suspected but not fully articulated, was that the authorization structure served manufacturers and dealers in ways that were not identical to the ways it served farmers, particularly the farmers who were his customers, who ran older machines, who were past warranty, who needed competent work at rates that reflected the economics of operations that were not large. The authorization would have changed what he was. He had spent 40 years being what the dealership needed him to be. He was not interested in spending the next portion of his working life being what the manufacturer's authorization required. He went back to the shop and got on with it. By the end of the third year, Walter's shop had generated $142,000 in annual revenue. He had Curtis full-time and had added a part-time arrangement with a retired farmer named Arlen Beck. No mechanical certification, but 40 years of practical knowledge about how agricultural equipment fails in field conditions. That is a different kind of knowledge from service manual knowledge, and equally important to a shop that is diagnosing problems rather than simply executing prescribed repairs. Arlen worked 2 days a week and was worth considerably more than 2 days of his time suggested. The Massey Ferguson 5711 that Walter had bought for $400 was not in his shop anymore. It was working ground 12 miles south on Don Perkins' operation, accumulating hours the way properly maintained machines accumulate hours, steadily, without drama, in the service of a man who knew what he had paid for it and trusted that the work behind it was sound. Walter occasionally saw it when he drove past the Perkins place on his way to a service call in the southern part of the county. He did not stop. There was no reason to stop. The machine was running. His work was done. What had not been done and would not be done for as long as Walter chose to keep working was the larger project of filling a service gap that had existed before him and would require his continued presence to remain filled. The farmers who called him were not calling a business. They were calling a specific man with a specific history and 40 years of knowledge that could not be replicated by a sign at the end of a driveway. The reputation was personal, built on the credibility of a man who told you what was wrong with your machine and what it would cost and whether it was worth fixing, and who had been right enough times that the question of whether he was right this time did not need asking. By the time the third year closed, and Walter sat with the notebook and the spreadsheet his daughter had built him and the full picture of what the operation had become, the cumulative 3-year revenue stood at $332,000. He did not celebrate the number. He noted it. He filed the notebook in the cabinet above the workbench beside the 2 notebooks that had preceded it. He wrote the year and the total on the spine in black marker, the same way he had labeled service records at the dealership for 40 years. Then he went to an estate auction in Comanche County, where a Massey Ferguson 7S with a destroyed transmission and a sound engine was listed without reserve, and he sat in the back of the crowd while the auctioneer worked through the morning's equipment and waited for the number to get low enough that the math worked in his direction. It did. It always did. For a man who knew what a machine was worth when other people were deciding it was worth nothing. The dealership consolidation that had handed Walter a severance check and cleaned out his toolbox had made a calculation about what 40 years of mechanical knowledge cost to carry on a balance sheet. The calculation had concluded that the cost was too high and that the knowledge could be replaced by the efficiencies that consolidation was supposed to produce. The farms that drove past the consolidated dealership on their way to Walter's shop were the answer to that calculation. They were not a verdict on the dealership. They were a market condition, the natural consequence of a service gap that appeared when the structure built to fill it was reorganized around priorities other than filling it. Walter had not sought the gap. He had simply been the person available to fill it, with the tools and the knowledge and the time and the lack of any particular reason not to. He had paid $400 for the machine that started it. The machine was running 12 miles south, doing the work it was built to do, on a farm whose operator had paid a fair price for it and received a sound machine in return. The man who had restored it was in his shop on a Tuesday morning, with 2 mechanics working beside him and a line of equipment outside that represented 30 farms across 3 counties that had decided his address was the right answer to the question of where to take a machine that needed attention. The auctioneer had called it sold for $400. Walter had decided it was worth considerably more than that. 3 years later, the numbers agreed with him completely. The truck arrived at 6:40 in the morning on a Thursday in April of 2007, and the man driving it did not knock on the door. He pulled directly into the equipment shed, hooked a chain to the front axle of the Massey Ferguson 6480 sitting in the first bay, and had it on the flatbed before Carl Brenner reached the shed door. Carl was 54 years old. He had been drinking his first cup of coffee when he heard the truck engine in the lot. He was still in his boots when he stepped outside and saw the 6480 going up the ramps. He said, "What are you doing?" The man on the flatbed said, "Repo order, first ag credit. You've got the paperwork inside." Carl said, "The payment isn't due until the 15th. The man said, "I don't handle the paperwork. Call the office." Carl said, "It's 6:40 in the morning." The man said, "Call when they open." The flatbed pulled out of his driveway with the Massey Ferguson 6480 on it at 6:52. Carl stood in the driveway and watched it go, and then went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the calendar on the wall. It was April 9th. The payment on the equipment note was due April 15th. He was not late. He had not missed a payment. He had not received a default notice, a demand letter, or a phone call. His tractor was gone. He called First Ag Credit when the office opened at 8. He was connected to an account manager named Dennis Hartley, who explained that the repossession had been authorized under a cross-default clause in Carl's loan agreement, a clause that allowed First Ag Credit to accelerate all outstanding obligations if any single account under their portfolio showed signs of financial stress. Carl's farm operating line, which was a separate account from his equipment note, had been flagged by First Ag Credit's risk assessment system after Carl had requested a 30-day extension on his operating line payment the previous month. Carl said, "I asked for an extension. I didn't miss a payment." Dennis said, "The extension request triggered a risk flag. The risk assessment authorized acceleration." Carl said, "My equipment note payment is not due until the 15th. I have 6 days." Dennis said, "The cross-default clause applies to all accounts simultaneously." Carl said, "Nobody told me my extension request would trigger repossession of my tractor." Dennis said, "The cross-default provision is in your loan agreement. Page 14, Section 6, Subsection C. It's April 9th. Planting starts in 11 days. Dennis said he understood the timing was unfortunate and that Carl was welcome to bring his account current and discuss a reinstatement of the equipment. Carl asked what bringing his account current meant in this context. Dennis said it meant paying the remaining balance on the equipment note, $61,400, plus the operating line balance and the reinstatement fee of $2,200. Carl said, "You want me to pay $63,000 in 6 days, or I don't get my tractor back for planting." Dennis said, "That is the reinstatement requirement, yes." Carl hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he called his attorney. Carl Brenner had been farming 580 acres in Benton County, Indiana, since 1986. He had built the operation carefully across 21 years, buying land when the price was right, adding equipment when the need was real, maintaining what he had with the seriousness of a man who understood that an equipment failure during planting or harvest was not just a mechanical problem, but a financial one, with consequences that compounded across the season. The Massey Ferguson 6480 was his primary tractor. He had bought it in 2004, financed through First Ag Credit on a 7-year note at 6.4%. The payments had been consistent. He had not missed one. The equipment note was current to the day they took the machine. The operating line was a different matter. The 2006 growing season had been difficult, a wet spring that delayed planting by 9 days, a dry August that cut his corn yield 23% below projection. His operating line payment, due in February of 2007, had been tight. He had called First Ag Credit in January and asked for a 30-day extension to allow his grain marketing to catch up with his cash flow. The request was reasonable, routine, the kind of accommodation that agricultural lenders make routinely for farmers managing the specific cash flow patterns of a commodity business. First Ag Credit had granted the extension. Carl made the payment within 30 days. His operating line was current. His equipment note was current. By any reasonable measure, Carl Brenner's accounts were in good standing on the morning of April 9, 2007. What had happened, Carl's attorney explained that afternoon, was that the extension request had been entered into First Ag Credit's automated risk management system as a distress indicator. The system flagged Carl's portfolio as elevated risk. It then applied the cross-default clause and authorized acceleration without human review. The repossession had been ordered by algorithm and executed by a contractor who did not know the account history and was not required to know it. Carl's attorney said, "This is going to be a problem for them." Carl said, "It's a problem for me right now. I have 11 days until planting." His attorney said, "Yes, we're going to address both." The attorney's name was Margaret Holloway. She had been practicing agricultural law in Lafayette for 19 years and had handled equipment repossession cases before, but not one with this specific fact pattern. A borrower current on all obligations, who had been granted an extension he subsequently fulfilled, whose tractor had been repossessed by automated system under a cross-default clause, never triggered by any actual default. She filed for an emergency temporary restraining order on the morning of April 10th. The motion argued that First Ag Credit had breached its implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing by applying the cross-default clause to a non-defaulting account, that the automated repossession without human review or notice violated the Indiana Uniform Commercial Code's requirements for commercially reasonable repossession procedures, and that Carl Brenner was suffering irreparable harm in the form of lost planting days for which no monetary compensation could be fully adequate. The circuit court judge heard the motion on April 11th. The judge granted the temporary restraining order on April 12th. First Ag Credit was ordered to return the Massey Ferguson 6480 to Carl Brenner's property within 24 hours. The machine was back in his shed on the evening of April 13th, 4 days after it had been taken, 7 days before his original planting target. Carl had lost 4 planting days. He adjusted his field schedule, prioritized his best corn ground, and compressed the work into longer days. He documented everything. The temporary restraining order was the beginning, not the end. Margaret Holloway filed suit against First Ag Credit in May of 2007, after the planting was complete and the full scope of the damage could be assessed. The complaint alleged 4 causes of action: breach of contract, breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, wrongful repossession under the Indiana Uniform Commercial Code, and conversion, the civil tort of wrongfully taking another person's property. First Ag Credit's initial response was to deny liability on all counts and to file a motion to dismiss, arguing that the cross-default clause unambiguously permitted acceleration in the circumstances that had occurred. The motion to dismiss was denied in August of 2007. The court held that the question of whether the cross-default clause had been triggered by circumstances that constituted commercially reasonable grounds for acceleration was a factual question that could not be resolved on a motion to dismiss. Discovery began in the fall of 2007 and produced, over the following 8 months, a document record that Margaret Holloway later described as the most useful discovery she had ever received in 19 years of agricultural litigation. The documents showed that First Ag Credit's automated risk system had flagged Carl's account based on a single input, the extension request, without considering any other factor in the account's history. They showed that the system had then generated a repossession order without any human review. They showed that First Ag Credit had a written internal policy requiring human review of all repossession authorizations above $50,000, a policy that had not been followed in Carl's case because the automation had routed the order directly to the repossession contractor without passing through the review queue. They showed something else. In the 18 months prior to Carl's repossession, First Ag Credit's automated system had triggered 14 similar cross-default accelerations across Indiana and Illinois, all of them involving farmers who had requested routine extensions and subsequently fulfilled their obligations. In 11 of the 14 cases, the farmers had not had the resources to challenge the repossession and had surrendered their equipment. In 2 cases, the farmers had reached private settlements. Carl's was the 3rd case to reach litigation. Margaret added a class action component to the complaint in March of 2008. The trial began in September of 2009, 2.5 years after the morning the flatbed arrived in Carl's driveway. The case had attracted attention in the agricultural community in a way that legal cases rarely do, not through media coverage, which was limited, but through the specific communication channels of farming communities, where a story about a lender taking a farmer's tractor on planting week based on an automated risk flag travels with the velocity and fidelity of something that everyone who hears it recognizes as directly relevant to their own situation. Carl had received calls from farmers he didn't know in counties he had never visited, asking about the case, sharing their own stories of First Ag Credit's repossession practices, some of which matched the pattern in the documents Margaret's discovery had produced. At trial, First Ag Credit's defense rested on 2 arguments. First, that the cross-default clause was unambiguous and that Carl had signed the agreement containing it. Second, that the automated repossession system, while it had not followed the internal review policy, had functioned as designed and that the design was commercially reasonable. Margaret's case rested on 3 things. The account history. Carl Brenner was current on all obligations on the morning his tractor was taken. The extension he had requested had been granted. He had fulfilled it within the 30 days. There was no default. There had never been a default. The algorithm had repossessed a machine from a borrower who owed nothing past due, based on a risk flag generated by a request that had been resolved months before the flatbed arrived. The internal policy violation. First Ag Credit's own written policy required human review of all cross-default acceleration decisions above $50,000. The policy existed because someone inside the company had understood, at the time it was written, that automated systems cannot read the full context of an account relationship. That person had been right. The policy had been bypassed because the automation routed the order directly to the repossession contractor without passing through the review queue. A person who had looked at Carl's account history, current payments, fulfilled extension, no delinquency, would have stopped the order. The system had not given any person that opportunity. The pattern. 14 similar cases across 18 months. 11 farmers who had surrendered their equipment without the resources to challenge. 2 private settlements. Carl's case was the third to reach a courtroom, and it was reaching that courtroom with documentation of the other 13 in the discovery record, which meant the jury was not looking at an isolated error. They were looking at a practice. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the 4th day, they returned a verdict for Carl Brenner on all 4 counts. Actual damages were assessed at $480,000, covering the yield loss from the 4 displaced planting days across 2 growing seasons. The cost of emergency equipment rental during the 4 days without the tractor, the documented stress and management disruption, and the legal costs of the restraining order and subsequent litigation. Punitive damages were assessed at $1,620,000, based on the jury's finding that First Ag Credit's conduct had been willful and systematic. Not an error but a practice, applied across 14 accounts, that had been insulated from correction by the automation that removed human judgment from the decision. Total verdict, $2,100,000. Carl Brenner sat in the courtroom when the verdict was read and did not immediately respond. He had been in this proceeding for 2.5 years. He had farmed through it, planting and harvesting, while the depositions were taken and the motions were filed and the discovery documents filled Margaret Holloway's office with the evidence of what First Ag Credit's system had done to 14 farmers in 2 states. He had done the accounting every season, updating the damage calculation with each harvest, keeping the records that Margaret's case required. He looked at the number, $2,100,000, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but the specific resolution of something that had been unresolved for a long time. The tractor had come back, the planting had happened, the farm had survived. The case had confirmed what Carl had known on the morning of April 9, 2007, when he stood in his driveway in his boots with his coffee going cold inside and watched his tractor go up the ramps of a flatbed that had not knocked on his door. What had happened was wrong. Not wrong in the abstract, but wrong in the specific and measurable way that a court had now documented in a verdict that carried a number. $2,100,000 was that number. First Ag Credit appealed. The appeals process extended the case through 2011. The appellate court upheld the verdict on the breach of good faith and wrongful repossession counts and reduced the punitive damages from $1,620,000 to $1,200,000, citing proportionality standards for punitive awards in commercial cases. The total award after appeal was $1,680,000. First Ag Credit paid in February of 2012, nearly 5 years after the flatbed left Carl's driveway with the 6480. The class action component of the original complaint had been severed from Carl's individual case and proceeded separately. It was settled in 2013 for an undisclosed amount that covered the 11 farmers who had lost equipment without the resources to challenge the repossession and had not received it back. The settlement required First Ag Credit to revise its automated risk management system to require human review of all cross-default acceleration decisions and to provide written notice to borrowers before any repossession action was taken. Margaret Holloway said when the settlement was announced that the policy changes were more significant than the money. She said that the practice that had been applied to Carl and to 14 other farmers had been insulated from correction precisely because the automation had removed the human moment at which the error could have been caught. The settlement restored that moment. It required a person to look at an account before a truck was sent to take a machine. Carl was 59 years old when the settlement was announced. He had been farming for 27 years. He still had the Massey Ferguson 6480. It had crossed 12,000 hours by then. He maintained it the way he had always maintained it. Oil every 100 hours, filters on schedule, pre-season inspections in March before the ground was ready to work. In March of 2013, doing the pre-season inspection, he found wear in the hydraulic pump that the hour meter and the maintenance schedule said was expected at 12,000 hours. He ordered the rebuild kit. He pulled the pump on a Saturday morning and rebuilt it over 2 days, following the service manual the way he had always followed it. He started the engine on a Monday. It ran clean. The hydraulics were full pressure. The tractor was ready for the season. He noted the hydraulic pump rebuild in his maintenance log. He noted the date and the hour count and the parts used and the cost. He closed the log and put it back on the shelf where it had lived since 2004. Carl Brenner still farms 580 acres in Benton County. He is 71 years old. The Massey Ferguson 6480 is still in his equipment shed. It has 16,000 hours on it. The hydraulic pump has been rebuilt twice. The engine has never been opened beyond routine maintenance. His son Thomas joined the operation in 2015. Thomas had been working in agricultural finance in Indianapolis, a career choice that Carl had never discouraged and never pushed toward, because the farm was something you came back to when you understood what it was and not before. Thomas came back in 2015 because he understood what it was. He had watched his father farm through a lawsuit and a harvest simultaneously, and understood from that observation that the farm was the thing and that everything else was in service of the thing. Thomas asked his father once what the lawsuit had really cost. Not the legal fees, not the yield loss. Those were numbers the verdict had covered. What had it actually cost? Carl said 4 days in April of 2007, when I didn't know if the planning was going to happen. That's what it cost. The rest was accounting. Thomas said, and the 2.5 years of litigation? That was the price of the accounting being correct. It needed to be done. But the cost was those 4 days. The 4 days when the tractor was gone and the planting window was moving, and the algorithm that had taken the machine had no idea what April meant to a farmer in Benton County. That was the cost, not the money. The verdict had addressed the money. Nothing had addressed the 4 days except the judgment Carl had carried since the morning he stood in his driveway watching the flatbed leave. That what had happened was wrong, and that the wrongness had been worth documenting, and that documenting it correctly had taken 2.5 years and had been worth every one of them. On the wall of his farm office, framed, is the cover page of the jury verdict from September of 2009. Not as a monument to the money. The money was what the damage required, nothing more, but as a document of what had happened on a Thursday morning in April of 2007 and what the accounting of that morning had eventually produced. Below the verdict, on the same wall, is the payment confirmation from First Ag Credit dated February of 2012. Carl put it there because it completed the record. The morning of April 9th, the verdict of September 2009, the payment of February 2012. 3 documents, 3 dates, the beginning and middle and end of a thing that had cost him 2.5 years of litigation, alongside 2.5 years of farming. He had not stopped farming during the litigation. That had not been an option, and it would not have been his choice even if it had been. The farm was the thing. The litigation was necessary but secondary, the mechanism by which a wrong was corrected, not the point of the correction. The point of the correction was the account history that showed Carl Brenner had not defaulted, the extension request that had been granted and honored, the equipment note that had been current on the morning a contractor hooked a chain to his front axle without knocking on his door. The Massey Ferguson 6480 is still in the shed. Carl starts it every spring the same way he started it before April of 2007, and the same way he started it after. Key in, throttle up, engine finding its idle in the way that a well-maintained diesel finds its idle, without drama and without complaint, the way any machine runs when it has been treated correctly across a long time. He does his pre-season inspection every March. He notes everything in the maintenance log. He plans the season from what the log and the fields and the calendar tell him. On April 9th of every year, he notes the date in his farm journal, not with extended commentary, just the date and one line. Tractor came back. It is the only entry he has made on that date since 2008 when he started the practice, and it will be the only entry he makes on that date for as long as he is farming. The tractor came back. The harvest happened. The court said what the morning had already said. $2,100,000 was the number. 16,000 hours is the current count. And the Massey Ferguson 6480 is in the shed, ready for another season. The same machine that a flatbed took at 6:52 in the morning on a Thursday in April, and brought back 4 days later because a judge had read the account history and understood what the algorithm had not. The season starts when the ground is ready. It always does. It always will.